Hello. Have you ever tried to photograph a waterfall only to get it back to your computer and discover that perhaps you went too long on the shutter and you were trying for a silky waterfall, but instead what you got was just a blur down the middle with no definition? Or perhaps there were areas that were overexposed or underexposed. The other option is maybe you were trying for a more realistic waterfall, and in the course of doing that, you ended up with water that maybe had a little bit too much definition, or maybe it was just a little bit too blurred. So today we're going to spend some time at a waterfall in Wisconsin and actually talk about some things that I do to try to get the waterfall photos that I really like. So let's head down the trail and see what we can do. So here we are at the falls, and you can see the water is looking really good. We have a lot that we can really do. My guess is you can probably hardly hear me over the rush of the water. So I think we're going to go and look for some interesting spots. It looks like it's going to be a little bit better off to the left-hand side, but there are some kind of interesting things I'm seeing even from right here. And so as I look over to the left-hand side, I see that little chute coming down by the log that's fallen over. There's also some interesting things with the tree just above it. And so let's see what we can figure out.
So obviously that was way too much noise coming from the water. So I thought we'd move it back to the office and talk a little bit more about capturing waterfall images. So first thing I'm going to talk about is capturing realistic waterfalls. And this is probably the easiest to do in terms of equipment. It doesn't really require much other than a camera. Tripod will help. Tripods always help with landscape images. And a polarizer may be something else that you want to use if there's a lot of glare. Although if you're shooting really wide, that can introduce some other issues that you may not want to deal with. So really, camera is all you need for this. So the question comes in, so what should my shutter speed be? And initially you might think, well, I want to go really fast, 1,000th of a second, 2,000th, want to really freeze the motion. But that doesn't quite look right, because if we do that, what we find out is that we end up with a very kind of odd looking image. We can see the individual water drops, and that's something we just don't see normally. So we want to try to get something that looks more like the kind of blur that our eye sees. And yes, I did say blur. So we do actually see blur as we're looking at things that are moving. It's just we're so used to seeing photos of things like birds in flight that are tack sharp that we don't really think about that. But the reality is we do see blur. So how much blur and what should we really look at? I did read an article on the B&H website. I'm not affiliated with B&H, but they do have a lot of great resources out there that compared the human eye to a camera. And one of the things it talked about was how it relates to shutter speed and blur. And they talked about between 1/100th and 1/200th of a second. But that got me thinking, what about video? So a lot of video is shot at 1/60th of a second for a frame rate of 30 frames per second. And so I thought, well, maybe that would be a good place to also look and try to figure out what makes really kind of the best photo. And so we'll go and look at a bunch of different examples shot with everything from 1/30th of a second to 1/320th of a second, and look at the differences and where I ultimately settled. Now, as with all things photography, a lot of it's going to depend on your own personal taste. So where I settled may not necessarily be what you like. Be interested to hear what you think is the best one of the different options that we look at. Okay, so let's look at 1/60th of a second. And what we see here is, for the most part, it looks pretty good. The one area that has a little bit too much blur for my taste is down in the lower right-hand portion. I don't know if my cursor is going to show very well. It's just a little crosshair, but you can see right in this area, just a little bit too much blur, so it doesn't really look, to me anyway, very realistic. So what if we go to 1/100th of a second? Now, this is looking a lot better. This area down in the lower right, is looking a lot more realistic to me. Maybe just a touch too much blur. I might like just a little bit less. And that's one thing that you'll notice is that when you look at the areas further away, you can actually have a lot more flexibility with shutter speed. But the parts that are closest to the viewer in the photo, or closest to the camera is probably a better way to put it, because obviously it's all the same distance from the viewer. But closer to the camera, that's where you're going to start to notice the difference. Now, what if we go up another stop to 1/200th of a second and see what that looks like? This actually looks pretty good. The only issue is I am starting to see in some areas, especially when I look at that little bit of waterfall back by the log or tree, whatever that is that has fallen over, I can start to see some of the water droplets in that. And that's probably not very realistic either, but that might be kind of a nitpick thing. So this might actually be one that, you'd say, okay, yeah, this is the one that to me represents a pretty realistic waterfall. For me personally, I would like just a little bit more blur. Just to kind of take it one step more though, let's look at 1/320th of a second. And so when I look here, now things are starting to maybe look a little bit too frozen, especially in that middle tier. I can see just a little bit too much detail, and I don't think I would have seen that if I was looking at that with my own eye. So where did I settle on? What did I prefer in terms of my favorite photo? And that actually was 1/125th. Like I said, there's just 1/100th, there's just a little bit too much blur. It was slight. Actually, I probably could have lived with that. I probably would have been happy with that. But just to be just a little nitpicky with myself, I just went up by a third of a stop to 1/125th of a second, and that to me gave me a very realistic waterfall. So that's how I would approach looking at a realistic waterfall. The nice thing is, really between that 1/100th and 1/200th of a second, it's really kind of fine tuning to see what looks the best to your eye. At least that's the way I prefer to do it. So it's almost like a formula at that point, knowing where you want to have your shutter speed. Next, we're going to talk about silky waterfalls. And with silky waterfalls, it gets a little bit more challenging because the rate of the water flow is greatly going to impact the look of our photo. And so we will look at that next. So when we look at silky waterfalls, I usually like to start with a 2-second exposure. This is kind of my starting point, and one of the reasons for that is it's really affected a lot by the flow of the water in terms of the results that you're going to get. Now, this was a pretty sunny day, so I did need to use a neutral density filter in order to be able to get a long enough shutter speed. In my case, I was using a Nissi 10 stop. That was probably a little bit too much for the day and the conditions. Probably could have gotten away with maybe a 4 stop. That would have probably been just fine because the water was really flowing. I didn't really have to slow down too much. But the 10 stop's what I used, and I was able to basically get whatever I wanted. So not too big of a deal that I ended up going with maybe too dark of a filter, but it worked for me. So when we look at the 2-second exposure, one of the things that we notice when we look over towards the right-hand side towards the bottom, there's not a lot of definition in the water, a little bit, but really not as much as I would like. It almost looks like it's even blown out, even though it's just really just blurred. So I need to go a little bit faster. So let's look at 1 second and see what that does instead. So when I look at 1 second, this is definitely better. I now don't have as much of that. There's still an area in the middle falls just behind that stick that is sticking up in the water that really doesn't look great. It's just a kind of a blob or a blur. Not sure I'll be able to get all of that out. I think some of that's also mist that's coming up. But I think if I go a little bit faster, that will also help as well. So looking at a 1/2 second, now I can see, now I've got a little bit better detail showing up pretty much across. this actually is a pretty usable image, I think. And I think I'd be happy with this, but I thought I would try a 1/4 second to see what that looks like as well. And so when I look at a 1/4 second, now I can see, yes, I like this a lot more. Even up in that area where that stick is, there's a lot more definition. Also down below, I really like the fact that I can see all the different lines in that in the water, all the different directions. That's the biggest part of the image. That's the part that's going to draw the most attention. So I really want to have that looking nice. So for this one, a 1/4 second seems to work well. Doesn't mean that a 1/4 second will work for every waterfall. If the water was coming much slower over the falls, if there's much less flow, we'd been having a lot of rain, so we had a lot of flow going on this day. If there was a lot less flow, 1/4 second really would not be long enough. I'd probably be looking at 2 seconds, maybe even 4 seconds. I've shot waterfalls as long as 8 seconds, where it has been late in the summer and there hasn't been a whole lot of water coming over to really kind of fill that area in. Also, if it happens to be windy and it's a waterfall coming over a cliffside, that's another area where having a longer exposure can really help, because that water is going to be pushed by the wind in various directions and it'll give you a little bit fuller look that way. So it really helps to experiment when you're going after these silky waterfalls. So next I'm going to show you the final images, the ones that I liked. You can let me know your thoughts if you like them, if you thought there's maybe a different composition you would have gone for from looking at some of these photos. Just leave that down in the comments. So let's take a look at what I thought were my favorite images from the day. Well, thanks for watching and hope you enjoyed this video. Really would be interested to hear your thoughts on how you approach waterfalls, or if there are other topics you would like me to cover in future videos, please leave those as well in the comments. Also, if you liked the video, please hit like. If you want to be notified about more things coming up as I post more content, hit the subscribe button. Thanks, and I will see you next time.